of sourdough is really interesting, partly because we don't really know the full history of sourdough. Sourdough culture exists in nature, and so because it exists in nature, it's possible that a lot of different cultures or people had discovered sourdough, and we don't really have any recorded history of it. What people needed to have, the technologies that they needed to have before they could discover sourdough would be, they would have to have a way to gather and grind seeds into flour. So that was one of the technologies that would be required before they could discover sourdough. And they would also have to have a way to cook the bread. So if a culture was advanced enough, or if people had found a way to ground their seeds into flour and to have a heat source to cook it, it's very possible that they were using sourdough. I think some of the first recorded, like the evidence that sourdough was used regularly in a culture was ancient Egypt. They had a lot of bread pans and a lot of things that denote that they probably were using wild fermentation to make bread. That's kind of when we start to see cultivated bread and bread that was made into dough and then baked. That's kind of where we start to see evidence of it. The Romans used sourdough regularly, and they were very good at it. And because the sourdough fermentation process actually increases the protein in flour, I believe that they used sourdough as a really important protein source for a lot of their people and their armies and different aspects of their nutritional program. So it wasn't until, I believe, in the kind of the mid 1800s that a microscope was invented to where that they could see what was actually happening within a sourdough culture. Before the microscope was invented, they really couldn't tell what was making that bubbly, yeasty, fermented smell and texture that was happening within bread flour. And I think once the microscope was invented, they were able to see that they were living organisms, and it was yeast and bacteria together. And it's kind of interesting because when they finally did see what was making sourdough culture work, there was kind of this reaction to get rid of bacteria. And we've seen a lot of evidence of that in our culture and in medicine and in food. And so once they discovered that yeast was what was making bread bubbly and making a nice fluffy loaf of bread, a lot of the scientists at the time set out to figure out a way to extract the yeast from the bacteria. And that's when they came up with processes to remove the bacteria in yeast and kind of break that symbiotic culture. That's when commercial yeast was discovered and cultivated. And once the commercial yeast kind of took off, I think at the time, it wasn't really understood how many nutritional benefits they were losing by getting rid of the bacteria in that fermentation process. And so the benefits that they did know about would be the time-saving aspect. And when you save time and you save labor, it creates a less expensive product, and it was just much easier to create breads and to sell them. And so I think it was generally thought of as a really positive thing. Also, commercial yeast is a little bit more predictable. When you're using wild sourdough culture, it's a living organism, and there's a lot more factors that can influence it. And so it's a little less predictable. So I think the invention of commercial yeast was a really positive aspect of, predictability. And so it was really embraced. Since that time, I think there's been a lot of discovery in the amazing health benefits that sourdough culture brings to bread and to wheat flours. And a lot of people are just wanting to get back to that nature-inspired bread that works so well with our bodies, the nutrition that comes from the bread after it's been really fermented with both the yeast and the bacteria. And there's been a lot of interest. I think in the 70s, a lot of people started picking back up cooking with sourdough. And recently, I've noticed a lot of people have had a lot more interest in sourdough. There's a lot of nutritional changes that we can measure now that people are becoming more aware of, and they want those benefits of that natural fermentation process. And there are other aspects that are really positive about cooking with sourdough as well, such as the flavor compounds. You don't necessarily get all the flavor components when you're using commercial yeast. So people are really loving that it's a really complex flavor profile that you get from sourdough. So I have some fun books, and I like to collect books when I see them on sourdough, and I have a pretty good collection, but some of the books have special meaning to me because they're written about Alaska, and the history with sourdough in Alaska is really rich. So in the 1800s, gold was discovered, and a lot of people came seeking wealth and looking to find their precious gold. But the conditions to live in Alaska are pretty rough. It's a rugged terrain, the weather's really harsh, and it takes a lot to survive here. One of the most important things that this early prospectors could have was a really strong sourdough culture, and they had to really protect it to keep it healthy and strong. And so one of the things that they would do with the cold climate is they would have their sourdough culture in a tin or maybe in a leather pouch or even a jar, and they would hold it near their body while they worked and while they slept, and their body heat would keep it from freezing so that they could continue to use it. Fortunately, if sourdough culture freezes, it's still viable when you thaw it out. If it gets too hot, that's when you might lose your culture. But even though it survives when it freezes, you can't use it until it's warmed up and bubbly and at a state of being active. So they would keep their starter close to their bodies or in a warm place so that they could continue to use it. Bringing food rations to Alaska was very difficult, and they often they didn't taste good and they would spoil. But with sourdough culture, you could just bring sacks of flour and you would have amazing, pretty gourmet food on a gold mine trail or at a prospect. So I think sourdough was just really key to a lot of people surviving. And in fact, it was so important that if someone had survived a whole year in Alaska, they would call them a sourdough. And that kind of denoted that they had been resourceful enough to keep their sourdough culture alive for a whole year, because it was almost impossible to survive if you didn't have your sourdough culture going and strong. And so when I learned that, I thought, I am a sourdough. I've kept my starter alive for a whole year. So I hope as you explore sourdough that if you keep your starter strong and healthy for a whole year, I hope that you'll consider yourself a sourdough and wear that title with pride.